On the 2nd of June, 2006, the Capital Markets Authority of Kenya suspended trading in the shares of a company called Uchumi Supermarkets. The suspension came the day after Uchumi's own board of directors had resolved that the company should cease operations, and on the same day that two secured lenders, Kenya Commercial Bank and the PTA Bank, moved to place the company under receivership. Total exposure at that point was approximately 2.2 billion Kenyan shillings. Roughly 891 million of that was owed to the two banks. Roughly 1.8 billion was owed to the retailer's suppliers. At the time of that suspension, Uchumi was the oldest formal supermarket chain in Kenya. It had been founded in 1975 as a public limited company owned by three Kenyan parastatals under a founding mandate to create retail outlets for Kenyan manufacturers. It had listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange in 1992. It had opened the first Kenyan hypermarket format in the 1990s, and it had crossed the Kenyan border in 2002, opening its first store outside the country in Kampala. When Wikipedia and the contemporary Kenyan trade press summarized what happened on the 2nd of June 2006, they used almost identical language. This was, they said, one of the greatest corporate disasters in independent Kenya history. Except that is not where the story ends. On the 31st of May 2011, exactly 5 years to the day after suspension, Uchumi Supermarkets was relisted on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. A new chief executive, a Kenyan accountant named Jonathan Kiano, had been running the receivership from July of 2006. Under his management, 5 reopened Nairobi stores had grown back into a 40-store network across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Turnover in the year to June of 2014 would climb to approximately 14.5 billion Kenyan shillings. The company would cross-list on 3 additional African stock exchanges. The Kenyan trade press would describe the Uchumi turnaround as one of the most remarkable listed company recoveries on the continent. And then, on the 15th of June, 2015, the same Uchumi board dismissed Jonathan Chiano and his chief financial officer for gross misconduct and negligence. A forensic audit conducted by KPMG covering the 2 years to the 31st of May 2015 would be presented to the board and to creditors, and the findings would ground a Capital Markets Authority action in August of 2016, imposing penalties of 21.7 million shillings and a 5-year ban from holding office in any Kenyan listed company. In the year to June of 2015, Uchumi posted a loss of approximately 3.2 billion Kenyan shillings. In October of that year, the retailer closed all its Uganda and Tanzania operations, laying off roughly 900 people across the two countries. This is the story of the oldest supermarket chain in Kenya, a company that Kenyan industrial policy invented in 1975, that Kenyan retail investors bought into on the Nairobi Stock Exchange in 1992, that collapsed for the first time in June of 2006, that came back from that collapse and looked, for a few years, like the great Kenyan corporate turnaround story of its decade, and that then collapsed a second time, in a different way, between 2015 and 2020. 51 years after its founding, Uchumi is still, technically, on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. It trades under a court-ratified Company Voluntary Arrangement. It operates 2 stores. This is Uchumi. Hi again, welcome back to the pod. My name is Farouk, and today we are going deep into the story of Uchumi. This is the story of the oldest formal supermarket chain in Kenya, a company invented by 3 Kenyan parastatals as an instrument of post-independence industrial policy, listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange, put through 2 full corporate collapses inside a single decade, and still, somehow, trading today under a court-ratified rescue arrangement. Let's get into it. The origin of Uchumi does not begin in a family shop in a small Kenyan town. It begins in a government office in Nairobi. In 1975, 3 Kenyan parastatals sat down together to incorporate a new public limited company under the Kenyan Companies Act. The 3 parastatals were the Industrial and Commercial Development Corporation, the Kenya Wine Agencies, and the Kenya National Trading Corporation. The founding mandate of the new company, in the words of the corporate charter, was to create outlets for the equitable distribution of commodities and to create retail outlets for Kenyan manufacturers. The name they chose for it was Uchumi. In Kiswahili, that word means economy. The name was a direct statement of purpose. The new company was intended to be an engine of the Kenyan economy. The 3 parastatals did not intend to learn the supermarket business from scratch. On the 17th of December, 1976, they signed a management and training contract with the Italian supermarket group Standa. Standa was, at the time, one of Europe's leading supermarket operators. Its role in the new Kenyan business was operational. Standa would run the day-to-day operations of the first Uchumi stores, and it would train the Kenyan personnel who would eventually take over the running of the whole organization. The first 3 Uchumi branches opened in Nairobi in the same year that the Standa contract was signed. One of them was at the Aga Khan Walk site in the Central Business District. The building that stands on that site is called, to this day, Uchumi House. It also houses the head office of ICDC, the anchor parastatal shareholder. From the very beginning, the physical, corporate and civic identities of Uchumi and of the Kenyan state were fused into one address. To understand why that mattered, understand the Kenyan retail environment Uchumi was walking into. In 1975, Kenya's grocery sector was almost entirely informal. Small counter shops called dukas, open-air markets, itinerant traders, the formal, self-service, aisle-based supermarket format that a middle-income European family would have taken for granted did not exist in Kenya at any meaningful scale. Uchumi was, from its first day of operation, the country's first at-scale formal retail operation, and it occupied that position substantively alone through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. When Atul Shah relaunched his family's Nakuru mattress shop as a supermarket format in 1987, he was doing so 11 years after Uchumi. When the Tusky supermarket chain was founded in 1990, that was 15 years after Uchumi. When Naivas was founded in 1998, that was 23 years after Uchumi. In the founding order of the entire modern Kenyan supermarket sector, Uchumi is first. Uchumi's second decade was quieter than its first. Through the 1980s, the company grew steadily inside Kenya on the operating template Standa had trained the founding team to run. In 1992, 17 years after founding, Uchumi listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. It was one of the first Kenyan retailers to list at all. This is the moment at which the story becomes complicated, because from 1992 onward, Uchumi was no longer simply a parastatal joint venture with tradable shares. It was a publicly listed company with an anchor state shareholder and a diffuse pool of Kenyan retail investors on top. Both sets of shareholders had claims on the company's direction. The tension between what a national industrial policy instrument was supposed to do and what a return-seeking public company was supposed to do would define every corporate crisis Uchumi ever had. In the 1990s, Uchumi did something no other Kenyan retailer had done. It introduced the hypermarket format to the Kenyan market. A hypermarket combined a full-line supermarket with a general merchandise offer inside a single, very large store. The Ngong Road Hypermart opened in 1997, and it became, along with Aga Khan Walk, one of the 2 anchor stores of the whole Uchumi brand. In 2002, Uchumi crossed the Kenyan border for the first time and opened a store at Garden City Mall in Kampala, Uganda. That opening was, for the Kenyan trade press at the time, a marker of arrival. A Kenyan retailer, publicly listed, was exporting the country's supermarket sector into a neighboring market. The story that ends with Uchumi as a small distressed 2-store operation begins in 1997 with the largest hypermarket in the country and in 2002 with a Kenyan flag flying above a Kampala storefront. On the 13th of December, 2001, the Industrial and Commercial Development Corporation seconded a private sector executive named Christopher John Kirubi to chair the Uchumi board. Chris Kirubi was, at that time, one of Kenya's most recognized business figures. He was a major ICDC shareholder in his own right, and by his own account, and by the account of the newspapers that would later write his retrospective, he inherited an Uchumi that looked, on paper, in reasonable shape. Turnover was in excess of 1 billion Kenyan shillings. Annual profit was more than 150 million. Cash reserves were of a similar order. Uchumi was not obviously a company in crisis. Yet, under Kirubi's chairmanship, Uchumi opened 6 new branches on an aggressive expansion drive. Gross profit rose from 1.224 billion shillings in 2001 to 1.373 billion the following year. That is a real increase. But the operating cost of running 6 new branches wiped it out. Operating profit fell from 118.5 million shillings in 2001 to 83.2 million in 2002. This is the specific mechanical failure at the root of the first Uchumi collapse. The company was opening more stores than it could afford to run, and it was booking gross profit growth while operating profit was going backwards. The Kenyan trade press, at the time, did not fully see the divergence. By 2004, Uchumi was reporting a net loss of approximately 699 million Kenyan shillings. The board's response to the 2004 losses became the single most cited pre-collapse governance failure at Uchumi. In that year, the Uchumi board approved the sale of the landmark Aga Khan Walk branch to a company called Allgate Limited. The sale price was 147 million Kenyan shillings. Uchumi then leased the same premises back at 1.7 million shillings a month, and an independent valuation, cited in a subsequent Kenyan court case, put the property closer to 500 million shillings. 5 years later, in 2009, Chris Kirubi, the then managing director Kennedy Tairu, and 12 other named accused would be charged in a Kenyan court with conspiracy to defraud Uchumi over the Aga Khan Walk transaction. On the 24th of May, 2011, Chief Magistrate Gilbert Mutembe would acquit all 14 accused, ruling that Uchumi was not a state parastatal in the sense required by the specific charging statute, and that the prosecution had not established conspiracy on the evidence. There is, on the public record, no criminal fraud conviction against any of the Aga Khan Walk defendants. But the transaction remains, in the Kenyan trade press, the most cited example of listed company governance failure of its decade. Chris Kirubi resigned from the Uchumi board in June of 2005. Losses continued to compound. By the first half of 2006, Uchumi was unable to service its bank facilities and was falling behind on supplier payments. On the 31st of May, 2006, the Uchumi Board of Directors resolved that the company should cease operations. On the 2nd of June, 2006, the debenture holders, Kenya Commercial Bank and the PTA Bank, placed the company under receivership. The Capital Markets Authority simultaneously suspended the shares from trading on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. Total exposure at that point was approximately 2.2 billion Kenyan shillings, roughly 891 million to the two banks, roughly 1.8 billion to suppliers. For the diffuse pool of Kenyan retail shareholders who had bought into the 1992 listing, the value of their shareholding moved to zero inside a fortnight. Wikipedia and the contemporary Kenyan trade press summarized what had just happened in almost identical language. This was, they said, one of the greatest corporate disasters in independent Kenya history. There was a rescue. On the 15th of July, 2006, 6 weeks after the receivership, a framework rescue agreement was signed between the government of Kenya, the debenture holders, and the supplier body. Under it, 5 Nairobi Uchumi outlets reopened the same day under a court-appointed, specialized receiver manager and an interim management team. The man who walked into the receiver manager role and who would run Uchumi as chief executive for the next 9 years was a Kenyan accountant named Jonathan Siano. His operating line, quoted by the Kenyan newspaper, The Standard, "For any receivership to be successful, you must have a manager or someone in charge who understands the business." Siano's early results were real. In 2008, Uchumi posted a profit of 106 million Kenyan shillings against a prior year loss of 257 million. 15 branches were operating. About 1,000 people were on payroll. 11 of the branches were in Nairobi. 3 were up-country. 1 was in Kampala. In March of 2010, Uchumi formally exited receivership. Kenya Commercial Bank and the PTA Bank converted the receivership debt they held into equity in the reopened company. It was, on any Kenyan corporate law reading, a genuinely rare achievement. A publicly listed company that had gone through a debenture holder receivership was now walking back into ordinary corporate operation, with its senior secured lenders converted into equity partners. On the 31st of May, 2011, exactly 5 years to the day after suspension, Uchumi Supermarkets was relisted on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. Over the following 3 years, Siano executed a second cross-border expansion. Uchumi Cross listed on the Rwanda Stock Exchange in October of 2013, on the Uganda Securities Exchange in November of the same year, on the Dar es Salaam Stock Exchange on the 15th of August 2014. The Kenyan retail store network rebuilt itself. The Uganda operation grew. Tanzania opened. By fiscal year 2014, Uchumi was reporting net sales of $165.4 million United States dollars, or approximately 14.5 billion Kenyan shillings, after tax income of about 384 million Kenyan shillings, and a network of approximately 40 stores across 3 East African countries. In April of 2014, Uchumi raised approximately 896 million shillings from a rights issue on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. A Capital Markets Authority investigation, still to come, would find that the information memorandum for that rights issue was, and I quote the regulator, "not updated with the material developments at Uchumi necessary to give investors the full picture of the impact of the funds raised through the rights issue." The Kenyan retail shareholders who subscribed for those rights would, inside 18 months, lose effectively their entire subscription. The turn began quietly. In June of 2014, Uchumi issued a profit warning, citing losses at its Uganda and Tanzania subsidiaries. Same-store sales growth in Kenya was flattening. Nakumatt, at the top end, was under its own debt-driven pressure and had lost its Westgate flagship the previous September. Naivas, at the middle, was modernizing fast. Carrefour, backed by the Emirati retail conglomerate Majid Al Futtaim, had just entered the Nairobi market at the upper end. And then, on the 15th of June, 2015, the Uchumi board, chaired by Khadija Meyer, held a press conference. Chief Executive Jonathan Chiano and Chief Financial Officer Chadwick Okumu had been dismissed for gross misconduct and negligence. Human Resources Manager Michael Kibi had been suspended. A general manager for operations named Owino Ayodo would take over as acting chief executive. A forensic audit had been commissioned. The auditor was KPMG. The scope was the 2 years to the 31st of May 2015. The findings of the KPMG Factual Findings Report, as summarized in the Kenyan press coverage of the creditor-facing document, were 4. The report alleged that Chiano's wife had become one of Uchumi's largest fresh produce suppliers without disclosure of the conflict of interest, that she had over-invoiced the retailer, that 46% of procurement staff at Uchumi did not meet the minimum qualifications set in the retailer's own HR manual, and that the accounts for the financial years 2010 through 2014, prepared by the then external auditor, Ernst & Young, contained misleading information. Jonathan Chiano's own position was, and remains, that he had resigned 2 days earlier, on the 13th of June, and that the subsequent board dismissal was null and void. A Kenyan court would later agree with him on the pure employment law question and award him 6.5 million shillings in gratuity and unused leave days. The Capital Markets Authority would go further. In August of 2016, the CMA imposed penalties totaling 21.7 million shillings on Chiano, Maire, Okumu, and former directors James Murigu and Bartholomew Regalo, and banned all 5 from holding office in any Kenyan-listed company for 5 years. Chiano was personally fined 5 million shillings and required to return 13.5 million shillings as proceeds of the undisclosed conflict of interest. A subsequent High Court decision by Justice George Odunga dismissed the CMA fraud charges on faulty disciplinary process grounds. The Court of Appeal subsequently reversed that dismissal. The final substantive resolution is not on the public record. In August of 2015, the board hired a new permanent chief executive. Dr. Julius Kipngetich had until that point been the Kenyan private sector's canonical parastatal turnaround executive, having run the Kenya Wildlife Service from December of 2004 to September of 2012, and Equity Group Holdings as chief operating officer from October of 2012 to September of 2015. The framing was direct. Kipngetich was there to save Uchumi. He would have 27 months to do it. In October of 2015, Uchumi closed its Uganda and Tanzania operations. Approximately 900 people were laid off across the 2 countries, about 400 of them in Uganda alone. Uganda and Tanzania had represented approximately 4.75% of Uchumi's stores. They had represented approximately 25% of its operating cost. Ugandan workers and suppliers were left substantively unpaid. The Tanzanian government subsequently demanded that the Kenyan government take responsibility for a 2.3 billion Kenyan shilling supplier claim. Both of those cross-border cleanup obligations remain live overhangs on the Uchumi balance sheet a decade later. In the year to the 30th of June 2015, Uchumi posted a loss after tax of approximately 3.2 billion Kenyan shillings. That was a 3.6 billion shilling swing from the record year that had preceded it. The Kenyan state, which had been an anchor shareholder for 4 decades, intervened. In December of 2015, the cabinet approved a 1.8 billion shilling bailout for Uchumi to be released in tranches. 500 million shillings was disbursed in January of 2016. A further 700 million was released later in the same year. But the remaining tranche was withheld after Uchumi failed to meet the stated conditions. This is a specific and important point about the character of the Uchumi rescue. The state did not extend an unconditional bailout to the retailer it had helped invent. It front-loaded 2/3 of the promised amount and walked away from the 3rd tranche. Meanwhile, Kipngetich had been running a parallel strategic investor process. The New York-based private equity firm, Kuramo Capital, had committed to a 3.5 billion shilling equity injection worth about 35 million United States dollars. At the last minute, Kuramo pulled out. A follow-on conversation with an unnamed Asian investor did not close. The specific reason for the Kuramo exit has never been placed on the public record. Kipngetich resigned on the 30th of November 2017 after approximately 27 months in the role. Chief Financial Officer Mohammed Ahmed Mohammed was appointed acting chief executive and would run Uchumi for the next 4 years. Stores continued to close. The Ngong Hyper flagship, the store that had defined Uchumi's hypermarket era, closed in this window. In December of 2018, Uchumi announced a 2.5 billion shilling sale of its largest disposable asset, a 17-acre parcel of land in Kasarani on the Thika Superhighway corridor, to a private company called Jewel Complex Limited, linked to a religious group known as Jesus Winners Ministry and to its leader, Edward Mwai Kiongo. The Kenya Defence Force, however, asserted a claim over 17 of the 20 acres of that land and placed a caveat on it. The Kasarani sale did not close. The retailer's largest source of potential cash generation was, from that point onward, tied up in a live litigation with the Kenyan military. On the 2nd of March 2020, creditors representing more than 70% of Uchumi's debt approved a company voluntary arrangement under the Kenyan Insolvency Act of 2015. Under the terms, banks would write off approximately 50% of their arrears. Suppliers would accept a haircut of approximately 30%. The effective creditor recovery, as summarized at the time, was around 30 cents on the shilling. On the 1st of July 2020, the High Court of Kenya ratified the arrangement. It was the first significant Kenyan public market retail CVA under the 2015 Insolvency Act, and it remains a leading Kenyan legal precedent for the restructuring of an insolvent publicly listed retailer. The 2020 arrangement did not work. The reason was mechanical. The Kasarani land was still tied up in the Kenya Defence Force caveat dispute, and without the sale of the Kasarani land, the CVA had no source of funds to pay creditor arrears. On the 31st of August 2023, a fourth creditors' meeting unanimously approved a revised company voluntary arrangement. Its principal terms were three. First, the eventual sale of the 17-acre Kasarani property to raise approximately 2 billion Kenyan shillings. Second, the conversion of 50% of creditor debt into convertible preferential shares in Uchumi. Third, the restructuring of government and Kenya Development Corporation debts into long-term non-interest earning loans. The dilution effect on the existing shareholders of Uchumi, if the supplier debt-to-equity conversion completes, is projected to be approximately 60%. The year 2025 brought an unexpected turn. Uchumi posted its first operating profit since 2014 on revenue of approximately 123 million Kenyan shillings for the year to the 30th of June 2025. The company reported operating profit of approximately 8.8 million shillings. The share price rallied. By November of 2025, it was up approximately 365% year-to-date. By early December, the year-to-date figure was 617%. By the 5th of December, one Kenyan market monitor put it at 841% year-to-date. The Capital Markets Authority responded by opening a fresh governance review of the counter. The Uchumi share, having traded as a distressed asset for almost a decade, was suddenly the best-performing counter on the Nairobi Stock Exchange for the year. The market structural end state of the Uchumi story is that the physical footprint has moved sideways into the surviving Kenyan chains. Naivas has taken the middle market. Carrefour has taken the upper end and the hypermarket anchor slots. Quickmart has taken the value end. Uchumi itself, in 2026, operates two full-time stores in Nairobi County. One is the Lang'ata Hyper on Carnivore Way, opposite Uhuru Gardens. The other is the Unicity branch at Unicity Mall. A third store at Kitengela on the Kajiado Road is scheduled to open on the 1st of July 2026. The peak network was approximately 40 stores. Peak turnover was approximately 14.5 billion Kenyan shillings. Current revenue is approximately 123 million. That is a top-line compression of about 99% across the decade. The building that stands on the Aga Khan Walk site is still called Uchumi House. It still houses the head office of the Industrial and Commercial Development Corporation, the parastatal that helped found Uchumi in 1975. The first Uchumi branch that opened on that site in 1976 is now a Naivas. The state anchor shareholding in Uchumi remains. It will be substantially diluted by the revised CVA supplier debt to equity conversion. The Kenyan state, which invented Uchumi as an instrument of post-independence industrial policy, is still a shareholder, 51 years later, in what is now a small-footprint distressed retailer with 2 stores. This is where the story sits, in July of 2026. There is a specific lesson buried in the Uchumi story that the Kenyan corporate governance conversation still, more than a decade after the second collapse, has not fully absorbed. The Nakumatt collapse of 2018 through 2020 was a family private company that could not scale governance to match the size of its operations. That anti-pattern is well understood. Uchumi is the mirror image case. It was a publicly listed company with an anchor state shareholder. It had audited accounts. It had a Capital Markets Authority listing envelope. It had every governance mechanism the family-owned chains did not have. And it failed anyway, twice, inside a decade. What Uchumi shows is that listing and state anchoring on their own do not solve for the underlying problem. Suboptimal expansion strategy, weak internal controls, misaligned incentives between operating management and long-term shareholders are the same failure pattern in both models. The reason Naivas is currently the surviving Kenyan supermarket flagship is not that it is publicly listed or state-anchored. It is not either of those things. The reason is that it has, so far, aligned its operating management, its shareholders, and its expansion strategy in a way that neither Nakumatt nor Uchumi ever quite managed to. 51 years after 3 Kenyan parastatals sat down to invent a company called Uchumi, the company still exists. It trades under a court-ratified rescue arrangement. It operates 2 stores. Its share price rallied 800% last year. Its founding building still bears the founding name, and the specific question of whether the current recovery is durable or a bounce off a very low base is the specific question every Kenyan supermarket operator standing today, from Naivas to Quick Mart to Carrefour, is quietly watching. This is Uchumi. That is the story. And like every story worth telling, this one is still being written. If this episode made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Farouk. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. Now you know this one. So start building, because yours might be tomorrow's origin story. See you on the next one.